Young lady, spectators sit in the back. Judge Richard Whitmore didn't raise his voice. He didn't have to. After 27 years on the bench, he had perfected something more effective than shouting, the quiet, polished tone of a man who expected everyone in his courtroom to know their place. A few heads turned. Emily Carter felt them before she saw them. At 25, she looked younger than most people expected from someone seated beside an attorney's table. Her blonde hair was tied into a simple ponytail, and a plain cream blouse disappeared beneath a modest gray cardigan. No designer handbag. No expensive jewelry. Just a worn leather folder resting beneath her hands. "Your Honor," Emily said softly, rising, "I'm with Harrison County Legal Aid. I'm assisting counsel with Mrs. Ellis's case." Whitmore looked over his glasses. His eyes traveled from her inexpensive shoes to the identification badge clipped near her waist. "Assisting counsel?" "Yes, Your Honor." A faint smile touched his mouth. It wasn't kindness. "Well, Miss Carter, assisting an attorney does not make you one." A restrained chuckle came from somewhere behind the opposing table. Emily's cheeks warmed. She could have defended herself. She could have explained that she had spent 6 nights organizing the case file, that she knew every affidavit, filing date, and exhibit almost by memory. Instead, she simply nodded. "I understand, Your Honor." Whitmore mistook her silence for submission. Before that morning ended, he would understand the difference. "Before we continue, where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments below. And if you believe in dignity and justice, hit like and subscribe. These stories spark change." Now, back to Emily. Morning sunlight spilled through the tall courthouse windows, cutting pale rectangles across polished wooden benches. Files rustled. Shoes tapped against marble. Above it all sat Whitmore beneath the state seal, elevated high enough that everyone addressing him had to look upward. Beside Emily sat Margaret Ellis, 67, a widow whose trembling fingers remained wrapped around an old photograph of a small white house. She had lived there for 34 years. Raised 2 children there. Buried her husband while still calling it home. Now a property company claimed paperwork gave them the right to take it. To Whitmore, Ellis versus Northbridge Holdings was another case on an overcrowded docket. To Margaret, it was everything. "Please rise." The bailiff's command faded, and proceedings resumed. Northbridge's attorney, Charles Bennett, stood confidently in a navy suit and began describing the dispute as straightforward. Emily listened without moving. Then Bennett referenced Exhibit 14. Her eyes dropped. Something felt wrong. She opened the folder. Page 43. Then 61. Her finger stopped beneath a date. Emily frowned. She checked the docket summary. Then the judge's earlier order. 3 dates. 1 document. An impossible sequence. Her heartbeat changed. Margaret noticed. "What is it?" she whispered. Emily didn't answer immediately. She checked again. Same result. Across the courtroom, Whitmore was already preparing to rule on the document. Emily quickly wrote 6 words on a yellow legal pad. Check Exhibit 14, filing date impossible. She slid it toward Attorney Daniel Reeves. He read it. His expression tightened. And from the bench, Judge Whitmore noticed everything. "What exactly," he said, leaning forward, "does your assistant find so interesting?" The courtroom became still. Emily slowly lifted her eyes. Whitmore smiled. He thought he had found another opportunity to put the quiet young woman in her place. He had no idea he had just invited her to examine the one detail that could unravel everything. 6 days earlier, Emily Carter had been sitting beneath a flickering fluorescent light at Harrison County Legal Aid, surrounded by cardboard file boxes nobody else wanted to open. The office occupied the second floor of an aging brick building between a pharmacy and a laundromat. Nothing about it suggested power. The carpet was faded, the coffee machine rattled whenever it brewed, and the heating pipes clicked behind the walls like an impatient clock. Emily liked it there. She had joined the center 18 months earlier as a legal assistant, a title that made people imagine photocopies, calendars, and neatly labeled folders. They rarely imagined what happened after everyone else went home. Emily read. She read statutes during lunch, appellate decisions on the bus, procedural rules while eating dinner from takeout containers. More importantly, she remembered what she read. Still here. Daniel Reeves appeared beside her desk, loosening his tie. Emily glanced at the clock. 9:17 p.m. I want to finish the Ellis file. Daniel sighed. Emily, Margaret's hearing is next week. Go home. Emily looked toward the boxes. Northbridge says the transfer is routine. It probably is. That's what bothers me. Daniel stopped. Emily pulled out a document. Margaret says she never signed away her interest voluntarily. Northbridge says everything was properly recorded. Both sides can't be right. Daniel studied her for a moment. He had learned not to dismiss that tone. What did you find? Nothing yet. Emily returned to the file. That's the problem. 3 days later, Margaret Ellis arrived wearing a faded blue coat and carrying an old photograph. Emily recognized the house immediately. White siding. Green shutters. A maple tree leaning over the porch. My husband planted that tree, Margaret said. Emily looked up. Thomas? Margaret smiled faintly. First summer after we bought the place. He said our children would climb it someday. Her fingers trembled over the photograph. They did. The room seemed quieter. Margaret explained how letters from Northbridge Holdings had begun arriving after a financial dispute involving an old lien. Then came notices filled with language she barely understood. Finally, she learned the company intended to claim possession. I'm not asking for charity, Margaret whispered. I just want someone to look at what happened. Emily's eyes remained steady. We will. That evening, she began rebuilding the case chronologically. Every notice. Every motion. Every recorded document. Every court order. She created a handwritten timeline across 3 yellow legal pads. Something gradually emerged. Not proof. A pattern. Several events happened unusually fast. Northbridge submitted paperwork. An order followed. Another filing appeared. Each individual step looked ordinary. Together, they felt wrong. Emily circled 3 dates. Daniel leaned over her shoulder the following morning. You think there's a procedural issue? I think there might be. With Judge Whitmore? Emily nodded. Daniel's expression changed. Everyone at the courthouse knew Richard Whitmore's reputation. He was intelligent, experienced, and fiercely protective of his authority. Lawyers who challenged him carelessly often left his courtroom wishing they hadn't. Be careful, Daniel said. Emily closed the folder. I'm not trying to challenge a judge. No, Daniel replied quietly. But judges sometimes think questions are challenges. Now, sitting in Whitmore's courtroom, Emily remembered those words. The judge was staring directly at her. What does your assistant find so interesting? Daniel started to rise. Emily touched his sleeve. Her eyes returned to Exhibit 14. She finally understood what had bothered her. The document had supposedly supported an earlier decision. But according to the court's own filing record, it had entered the docket afterward. Emily stood. And somewhere behind Judge Whitmore's amused expression, pride was already making the mistake that truth would soon punish. Emily rose slowly, the yellow legal pad still beneath her fingertips. For a moment, the only sound in the courtroom was the faint hum of the ventilation system. "Your Honor," she began, "I noticed a discrepancy in the filing sequence." Judge Whitmore leaned back. "A discrepancy?" "Yes, Your Honor." "And you discovered this while assisting Mr. Reeves?" Emily heard the amusement beneath the question. "I discovered it while reviewing Exhibit 14. Whitmore glanced toward Charles Bennett. The attorney gave a small shrug, almost smiling. "Ms. Carter," Whitmore said, "what exactly is your legal qualification?" Daniel immediately stood. "Your Honor, Ms. Carter is part of our legal support team. If the court would allow me." "I asked her." His voice sharpened. Daniel stopped. Emily felt every eye turn toward her. "I'm a legal assistant at Harrison County Legal Aid." Whitmore removed his glasses with deliberate slowness. "So you are not an attorney?" "No, Your Honor." "You have not been admitted to the bar?" "No." "And yet you believe you have identified a procedural defect that apparently escaped two licensed attorneys and this court?" A few people shifted on the wooden benches. Someone near the back gave a quiet laugh. Emily's face warmed, but her voice remained controlled. "I'm only asking that the dates be verified." Whitmore smiled. There it was. Not curiosity. Pride. Court procedure is not a puzzle, Ms. Carter. It is not something one masters by organizing paperwork. The words landed harder than their volume suggested. Margaret lowered her eyes. Bennett leaned toward his associate and whispered something that made the younger man smirk. Emily could feel humiliation spreading through the room without anyone needing to say another word. Whitmore had accomplished exactly what he wanted. He had reduced her from someone raising a legitimate concern to a young assistant who had forgotten her place. But Emily looked down at Exhibit 14 again. March 18th. Her eyes moved to the earlier order. March 12th. 6 days. She checked the docket number. No mistake. Your Honor, Emily said quietly, the issue isn't an interpretation of the document. Whitmore's expression hardened. I believe I've heard enough. But the chronology. Ms. Carter. His voice cracked through the courtroom. Silence fell instantly. Emily stopped. Whitmore leaned forward. This court has spent decades applying rules that cannot be learned from a few late nights with case files. There is a reason attorneys receive training before standing where Mr. Reeves stands. Daniel's jaw tightened. Emily said nothing. Whitmore mistook that silence for defeat. Again. Then Margaret's trembling hand found Emily's wrist beneath the table. Emily looked at her. The older woman said nothing. She didn't need to. That small touch reminded Emily why she was there. Not to win an argument. Not to embarrass a judge. To make sure someone actually looked. Emily turned back toward the bench. With respect, Your Honor, may I ask one question? Whitmore stared at her. The room waited. Then he gave a thin smile. Go ahead. Emily lifted Exhibit 14. This document is listed as filed on March 18th. Yes. But the order relying on it was entered March 12th. The smile on Bennett's face disappeared. Emily continued. If the docket is accurate, how could the court rely on evidence that had not yet been filed? No one moved. Whitmore's eyes shifted toward the document. For the first time that morning, he did not answer immediately. And Emily knew she had found the first crack. Judge Whitmore stared at Exhibit 14 for several seconds. Then his expression changed. Not into concern. Into irritation. "Mr. Reeves," he said, turning away from Emily, "perhaps you would like to explain why your assistant is interrupting these proceedings with administrative speculation." Daniel stood. "Your Honor, if the dates are accurate, I believe Ms. Carter has raised a legitimate question." "A legitimate question?" Whitmore's voice carried across the courtroom. He picked up the document, examined it briefly, then placed it down as though the matter bored him. "Electronic records are amended. Documents are re-entered. Clerical timestamps can reflect processing rather than submission. Surely I don't need to explain basic docket administration." Bennett immediately rose. "Your Honor, Northbridge agrees. Exhibit 14 was properly considered, and opposing counsel has never previously challenged its authenticity." Emily noticed the wording. Authenticity. She had never questioned whether the document was real. She had questioned when it entered the case. "They're not the same issue," Emily whispered. Whitmore heard her. His eyes snapped toward her. "Excuse me." Emily stood straighter. "I said authenticity and chronology are different issues, Your Honor." The room tightened. Daniel glanced at her, warning in his eyes, but it was already too late. Whitmore descended into silence for a moment, studying Emily as if she were no longer merely inconvenient. Now she had become insolent. "Ms. Carter, you appear remarkably confident for someone without a law license. I'm asking about the record. And I am telling you the record is more complicated than you understand." A murmur traveled through the gallery. Whitmore saw it. His pride demanded control. "Perhaps," he said, folding his hands, "we can settle this little misunderstanding." Daniel frowned. "Your Honor." "No, Mr. Reeves. Your assistant seems determined to offer legal analysis. Let us hear it." Emily froze. Whitmore gestured toward the open space before the bench. "Come forward, Miss Carter." Margaret tightened her grip on Emily's sleeve. "You don't have to," she whispered. But Whitmore was already smiling. "Explain to this courtroom precisely why Exhibit 14 creates the procedural catastrophe you seem to imagine." Bennett lowered his eyes to hide a grin. Several spectators leaned forward. It was no longer about Margaret's house. Whitmore wanted a demonstration. He wanted Emily standing alone beneath the state seal, separated from Daniel, exposed before attorneys who had spent more years practicing law than she had spent being an adult. And he wanted her to fail publicly. Emily gathered the file. Her first step echoed against the marble floor. Then another. She stopped before the bench. Whitmore looked down at her. "Well?" Emily opened the folder. Exhibit 14 was entered on March 18. We established that. The order was entered March 12. We established that too. And the order specifically references information contained in Exhibit 14. Whitmore's smile thinned. "Which proves nothing." Emily paused. Whitmore leaned back, sensing his opportunity. "In fact, Ms. Carter, there is controlling precedent permitting a court to consider material submitted before formal docket processing." He named the case. Daniel's face changed. Bennett smiled openly now. Whitmore watched Emily carefully. "There," he said. "That is the danger of mistaking suspicion for legal understanding." A few quiet laughs followed. Emily looked down. To everyone watching, she appeared trapped. But Whitmore had just made one mistake. Emily knew that precedent. She had read the entire decision 3 nights earlier. And the section he had just invoked did not destroy her argument. It completed it. Emily slowly raised her eyes. "Anything else, Miss Carter?" Whitmore asked. Her voice was calm. "Yes, Your Honor." The laughter stopped. Emily did not move. For 3 seconds, she simply stood beneath the bench with the file open in her hands. Judge Whitmore's smile remained fixed. "Yes, Your Honor," she repeated. "There is something else." She turned one page. "The precedent you cited does allow a court to consider material received before formal electronic docketing." "Exactly," Whitmore said. "But only when the record establishes that the material was actually submitted before the ruling." The smile faded slightly. Emily continued. "In that case, the clerk received the evidence before the order was issued. The electronic timestamp came later because processing was delayed." Bennett stopped writing. Whitmore leaned forward. "I'm familiar with the decision." "I'm sure you are, Your Honor." Her tone contained no sarcasm. That made the words land harder. The court specifically distinguished delayed docket entry from evidence that had not yet been received. Without proof of earlier receipt, the exception doesn't apply. Silence spread across the gallery. Whitmore's fingers tightened around his pen. "And you believe there is no such proof here?" Emily looked toward the clerk. "I believe the record should answer that." For the first time, Whitmore hesitated. Daniel was already searching through his copy of the case. His finger raced down the page. Then stopped. He looked at Emily. She was right. "Your Honor," Daniel said, standing, "the language she's referring to is here." Bennett quickly opened his laptop. Whitmore's jaw tightened. "What paragraph?" 47. Keys clicked. Pages turned. The sound seemed unnaturally loud now. A minute earlier, people had been laughing at the young legal assistant standing alone before the bench. Nobody was laughing anymore. Whitmore read the paragraph. His eyes slowed. Then returned to the beginning. Emily watched recognition appear on his face before discipline buried it. "That still does not establish an irregularity," he said. "No, Your Honor." The answer surprised him. Emily closed the casebook. "It establishes that the exception you cited requires evidence of prior submission." She glanced toward Exhibit 14. "So we only need to determine whether that evidence exists." Whitmore looked toward the clerk. "Check the intake record." The clerk began typing. Emily stepped back. She should have felt relief. Instead, something bothered her. A sentence Whitmore had used moments earlier repeated in her mind. "Materials submitted before formal docket processing." Submitted before. Emily reopened the file. If Exhibit 14 had been physically received on March 12 or earlier, there should be an intake notation. A scan record. An attachment reference. Something. Her eyes moved across the docket history. March 11th. March 12th. March 18th. Then she saw it. A reference number attached to Whitmore's March 12th order. Emily's breathing slowed. She compared it with Exhibit 14. Same identifier. That should have been impossible. Unless. "Your Honor," the clerk said. Whitmore looked over. "I'm still checking the archived intake logs." Continue. Emily barely heard them. She was staring at the number. This was no longer merely about whether a document had been processed late. The court's March 12 order appeared to reference an exhibit identifier that, according to the system, was not generated until March 18. Daniel noticed her expression. "What?" Emily slid the page toward him. He studied it. The color drained from his face. Whitmore saw their exchange. "What now, Miss Carter?" Emily looked up. Her eyes were steady. "I think we may be asking the wrong question, Your Honor." The courtroom became still again. Because Emily had just realized the filing date was only the first crack. What lay beneath it could be far worse. Judge Whitmore's expression hardened. "The wrong question?" Emily nodded. "Yes, Your Honor." A restless murmur moved through the gallery, but Whitmore silenced it with a glance. "Then enlighten us." The challenge was unmistakable. Emily returned to the table and placed 2 pages side by side. The March 12 order references Exhibit 14 using this identifier. Daniel followed her finger. "And the docket shows that identifier was assigned on March 18. Bennett stood abruptly. "Your Honor, this is becoming speculative." Emily looked at him. "Then the metadata should resolve it." Whitmore's eyes narrowed. "Miss Carter, you are drifting dangerously close to making accusations without evidence." "I'm not accusing anyone." "Then what are you doing?" "Reading the record." The answer hung in the air. Whitmore's face tightened. "Clerk." The clerk straightened. "Have you found the intake entry?" "I'm checking the archived system now, Your Honor." Whitmore turned back to Emily. "You seem convinced you've uncovered something extraordinary." "No." Her voice remained quiet. "I'm convinced the dates need an explanation." That calmness irritated him more than defiance would have. Whitmore had spent decades controlling courtrooms through authority. He understood angry attorneys. He understood nervous witnesses. He understood people who backed down when his voice sharpened. Emily was doing none of those things. She was simply waiting for the facts. The clerk's keyboard clicked rapidly. Emily looked again at the March 12 order. Then another detail caught her attention. The order didn't merely identify Exhibit 14. It quoted language from it. Her pulse quickened. "Daniel." She pointed. He read the sentence. Then looked at the exhibit. Word for word. Bennett noticed their reaction. "What are they doing?" Whitmore ignored him. Emily raised her hand slightly. "Your Honor, may I point out one additional issue?" Whitmore exhaled. "Proceed." The March 12 order quotes a sentence from Exhibit 14. "So." Emily lifted the exhibit. "This exact sentence." Daniel handed the order forward. The bailiff carried it to the bench. Whitmore compared the pages. For the first time, something other than annoyance appeared in his eyes. Emily saw it. Recognition. Not fear. Not yet. The language could have appeared in earlier materials, Whitmore said. It could have. Emily nodded. "That's why I checked." She opened the earlier filings. The sentence doesn't appear in them. Bennett rose again. "We cannot possibly establish that from a quick courtroom review. I searched every filing submitted before March 12. "You personally searched them?" "Yes." Bennett gave a dismissive laugh. "All of them?" Emily looked directly at him. "All 486 pages." The laugh died. The clerk suddenly stopped typing. The sound vanished so abruptly that several people turned toward him. Whitmore noticed. "What is it?" The clerk stared at his monitor. "Your Honor." Whitmore's voice sharpened. "What did you find?" "There is no intake record for Exhibit 14 before March 18. Nobody moved." Bennett slowly sat down. Whitmore looked at the clerk, then at the order before him. Emily felt Daniel's hand close around the edge of the table. The first question had now been answered. Exhibit 14 had not merely been docketed late. According to the court's own archive, it had not been received until 6 days after an order quoted from it. Whitmore lifted his eyes toward Emily. His confidence was gone. And Emily finally understood why the chronology had felt wrong from the beginning. The impossible date wasn't a clerical error. It was evidence that something inside the case had happened out of order. For several seconds, Judge Whitmore said nothing. The courtroom that had once seemed to belong entirely to him now felt different. Emily could hear the ventilation humming above the gallery. Somewhere behind her, a wooden bench creaked. Whitmore looked at the clerk. "You're certain?" "Yes, Your Honor." The archived intake log shows Exhibit 14 was received at 9:42 a.m. on March 18. "And there's no earlier submission?" "None that I can locate." Whitmore glanced down at the March 12 order. The document suddenly seemed heavier in his hands. Bennett rose. "Your Honor, there may be another explanation. Perhaps Northbridge transmitted a courtesy copy directly to Chambers." Emily's eyes shifted toward him. Whitmore answered too quickly. "That is possible." And that was the moment everything changed. Emily froze. Not because the explanation frightened her. Because it gave her the final piece. "A courtesy copy," she repeated. Whitmore looked at her. "Yes, Ms. Carter. Attorneys sometimes provide Chambers with materials before formal filing." Daniel slowly turned toward Emily. He saw it too. Emily opened Northbridge's certificate of service. If Exhibit 14 was sent directly to Chambers before March 12, there should be some record of transmission. Bennett's face tightened. "Not necessarily. For material relied upon in an order." Bennett didn't answer. Emily continued carefully. "The March 12 order doesn't merely mention the substance of Exhibit 14. It identifies the exhibit number and quotes its language exactly." Whitmore shifted in his chair. "Your point?" Emily's voice became even quieter. "My point is that we now have two possibilities." She placed the documents side by side. Either Exhibit 14 existed before March 12 and reached the court outside the official docket. A hush settled over the room. Or it did not exist in this form until March 18. Margaret stared at Emily. Daniel stopped breathing for a beat. Even Bennett seemed to understand where the logic was leading. Emily did not accuse him. She didn't need to. If it existed earlier, she continued, then we need to know who sent it, when it was received, and why opposing counsel was never served. Whitmore's jaw tightened. And if it didn't? Emily looked at the order. Then we have to explain how an order dated March 12 quoted language from a document created 6 days later. The room went completely silent. Whitmore's fingers curled around his pen. Bennett stood again. "This is outrageous. She is implying misconduct based on metadata she is not qualified to interpret." Emily turned toward him. "Then let someone qualified interpret it." The words landed without anger. That made them impossible to dismiss. Daniel rose. "Your Honor, we request preservation and review of the electronic audit trail, including creation timestamps, upload history, service records, and any communications transmitting Exhibit 14. Whitmore stared at him. Then at Emily. The same young woman he had mocked for organizing paperwork had just transformed that paperwork into a question no one in the courtroom could safely ignore. The clerk cleared his throat. "There's something else, Your Honor." Every head turned. He looked uncomfortable. "The system preserves the original creation record for uploaded exhibits." Whitmore's face went still. "And?" The clerk swallowed. Exhibit 14's original file was created on March 17. A gasp moved through the gallery. Emily didn't smile. She simply looked at the March 12 order. Now there was no earlier document to explain. No delayed processing. No harmless clerical mistake. An order had quoted words from a file that, according to the court's own system, would not exist for another 5 days. Whitmore looked at Emily. For the first time, he wasn't looking down at her. He was looking for an answer. And Emily had one question left. The courtroom remained frozen. Judge Whitmore stared at the clerk as though the right expression might somehow change what had just been said. March 17, he asked. Yes, Your Honor. Whitmore looked down at the order dated March 12. 5 days before the file existed. Charles Bennett rose halfway from his chair. There must be a synchronization error. The clerk shook his head carefully. The creation timestamp comes from the original uploaded file, not merely the docket entry. Bennett sat back down. Emily watched Whitmore's hand tighten around his pen. Minutes earlier, he had challenged her qualifications before an entire courtroom. He had invited laughter because he believed authority could settle a question before evidence ever had the chance. Now the evidence was speaking for itself. Emily stepped forward. Your Honor. Whitmore lifted his eyes. There was no amusement left in them. Emily could have reminded him of every insult. She could have repeated his words about legal training and administrative paperwork. She did neither. Instead, she held up the March 12 order. I have one question. Whitmore said nothing. If Exhibit 14 was created on March 17 and received by this court on March 18. Emily paused. Every face in the room seemed fixed on her. How could an order entered on March 12 quote it word for word? Silence. Not the obedient silence Whitmore commanded when entering his courtroom. This was different. This silence belonged to the question. Whitmore opened his mouth. Nothing came. His gaze dropped to the order. Then to Exhibit 14. Then toward the clerk. For the first time that morning, the man who always seemed to have an answer had none. Bennett tried to intervene. Your Honor, I strongly object to the implication. Daniel stood. No accusation has been made. He placed both palms on the table. We're asking for an explanation supported by the record. Whitmore looked toward Bennett. When did your office prepare Exhibit 14? Bennett hesitated. I would need to consult our internal records. That wasn't my question. The attorney swallowed. I don't know. A murmur rolled through the gallery. Whitmore struck his gavel. Order. The room quieted again. But the authority behind the sound felt strangely diminished. Whitmore turned toward the clerk. Preserve the entire electronic record. No files are to be modified, replaced, or removed. Yes, Your Honor. All audit logs, submission records, communications, and document histories are to be secured immediately. Bennett stood. Your Honor. Sit down, Mr. Bennett. This time, nobody laughed. Whitmore looked toward Margaret. Then Daniel. Finally, Emily. His expression carried something she had not seen before. Not admiration. Not yet. Recognition. The realization that the person he had dismissed had noticed what everyone else had overlooked. This matter cannot proceed today, he said. Margaret's hand flew to her mouth. Enforcement concerning Mrs. Ellis's property will be stayed pending review of the record. Margaret closed her eyes. A tear slipped down her cheek. Emily returned to the table and gently covered the older woman's trembling hand with her own. Whitmore watched them. Ms. Carter. Emily turned. The courtroom waited. He seemed about to speak, but whatever words came to him were not enough. Emily gave him no triumphant smile. She needed none. The young woman he had ordered toward the back of the courtroom was now standing at its center, not because she possessed a title, but because she had refused to stop looking when something was wrong. And sometimes, the most powerful person in a room is simply the one willing to ask the question everyone else ignored. 3 weeks later, Margaret Ellis stood on the front porch of the little white house she had feared losing forever. The maple tree her husband had planted moved gently in the autumn wind. Emily stood beside her, holding a thin folder. "The review is complete," she said. Margaret searched her face. "And?" "The enforcement order was vacated. Your case will be reheard using the verified record." Margaret pressed one hand against her chest. "So I can stay?" "For now, yes. And this time, every document has to be accounted for." Margaret's eyes filled with tears. She reached for Emily and pulled her into an embrace. Emily closed her eyes. There were no cameras. No applause. Only an old porch, rustling leaves, and a woman who had finally been heard. The investigation into the irregular filing had moved beyond Margaret's case. Court administrators preserved the electronic records and referred the matter for independent review. Northbridge Holdings was ordered to produce its internal document history, while questions surrounding Exhibit 14 remained under formal examination. No dramatic arrest happened overnight. No single courtroom speech solved everything. Justice rarely moved that way. But something had changed. And so had Judge Richard Whitmore. 2 months later, Emily returned to his courtroom with Daniel on another legal aid matter. She wore the same gray cardigan. The same inexpensive shoes. The same quiet expression. When she entered, Whitmore noticed her immediately. Their eyes met. For a second, Emily remembered his voice. "Spectators sit in the back." But this time, Whitmore did not dismiss her. "Ms. Carter," he said. Emily stopped. "Yes, Your Honor." The courtroom became quiet. Whitmore looked toward the attorneys, then back at her. "I owe you an acknowledgement." Daniel glanced at Emily. Whitmore continued. "You identified a serious discrepancy in a record this court had accepted without sufficient examination." His voice was measured. "No performance. No excuses. I also treated your position as a reason to dismiss your observation." Emily remained silent. Whitmore took a breath. That was wrong. The words seemed almost strange coming from him. But they mattered. Emily gave a small nod. "Thank you, Your Honor." That was all. She did not demand humiliation in return. She did not remind the courtroom how he had laughed at her. Because dignity was never about making another person feel small. It was about refusing to become small simply because someone powerful wanted you to. The hearing began. This time, when Emily passed Daniel a note, Whitmore waited. He listened. And somewhere across town, Margaret Ellis opened the curtains of the home where her children had grown up and watched morning light fall across the maple tree her husband had planted decades before. One careful question had not fixed the entire justice system. But it had protected one woman long enough for the truth to be examined. It had forced a powerful man to confront the difference between authority and infallibility. And it had reminded everyone in that courtroom of something titles often make people forget. Emily had walked in looking ordinary. She had no expensive suit, no impressive office, no place on the bench. What she carried was quieter. Patience. Preparation. Courage. And the discipline to follow the truth when everyone else had stopped looking. As Emily gathered her files after the hearing, Whitmore watched her leave. This time, he said nothing. He didn't need to. The courtroom doors closed softly behind her. Some people need a title to feel powerful. Others need only the truth.